Once upon a time in the bustling, vibrant city of Milan, there lived a girl named Isabella. She was a striking beauty, the kind of woman who turned heads wherever she went. Her olive skin glowed in the golden light of the sun, and her long dark hair flowed like silk down her back. Her eyes, the color of amber, sparkled with intelligence and mystery. She came from a well-off family, and her charm, elegance, and natural grace made her a magnet for attention. But what truly set her apart was her heart, a heart that beat not for wealth or luxury, but for something deeper. Isabella had no shortage of suitors. In fact, it was quite the opposite. The city's wealthiest men, from business tycoons to sons of oligarchs, courted her with all the extravagance their fortunes could buy. Lavish gifts, exotic vacations, diamonds, cars. Isabella had seen it all. They showered her with luxuries, assuming that a girl like her would be swayed by the glint of gold or the promise of a life lived in the lap of luxury. But Isabella wasn't like most girls. While she appreciated the kindness of these men, their wealth never impressed her. She had grown up in an environment where money flowed freely, and she had seen firsthand how it could corrupt people, blind them to the things that really mattered. Her parents had a cold, distant marriage, held together more by social expectations than love. Her friends were often trapped in shallow relationships, bound by the convenience of wealth rather than true affection. Isabella longed for something different, something real. It was on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that her life changed forever. She had been walking through the narrow cobblestone streets of an older part of the city, her mind wandering aimlessly, when she noticed a small crowd gathered near an alleyway. Curiosity piqued, she approached the scene. There, by the edge of the street, was a young man, perhaps in his mid-20s, sitting against a stone wall. He was dirty, his clothes tattered, his hair a mess. He was clearly homeless, his thin frame showing signs of malnourishment. But what struck Isabella wasn't his appearance, it was the guitar in his hands. His fingers danced across the strings with a grace and precision that seemed almost magical. The music he played was hauntingly beautiful, each note filled with passion and pain, joy and sorrow. The crowd around him was silent, captivated by his playing. There was something raw, something authentic in his music that resonated deep within her. For reasons she couldn't explain, Isabella felt drawn to him. She stepped closer, her heart beating faster. As the final note of his song faded into the evening air, the man looked up, and their eyes met. His were a deep, soulful blue, filled with a mixture of surprise and intrigue. "I don't play for money," he said softly, as if he could sense her intention to offer him something. "I play for the music." Isabella was taken aback. In her world, everything had a price. Yet here was a man who seemed to reject that very idea. She knelt down beside him, ignoring the stares of passers-by, and asked, "What's your name?" "Marco," he replied, his voice low and hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken much in days. Isabella smiled. "You're an incredible musician, Marco. You shouldn't be here on the streets." He shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the compliment. "I don't have much of a choice. Life, it doesn't always turn out the way you expect." For the first time in her life, Isabella didn't know what to say. Here was a man who had nothing, yet somehow he seemed more free than anyone she had ever known. They talked for hours that night, sitting on the cold pavement. Marco told her his story, how he had grown up in a small village outside the city, how his family had lost everything in a fire, and how he had come to Milan in search of a better life, only to find that the city was far less kind than he had hoped. Over the next few weeks, Isabella found herself returning to that same street corner, drawn to Marco's music and the quiet strength he exuded. They talked about everything: music, life, love, and the world they both wanted to escape. The more time she spent with him, the more Isabella realized that Marco was everything she had been searching for: honest, kind, passionate, and completely unpretentious. Word spread quickly among Isabella's wealthy friends and suitors that she had been spending time with a homeless man. The gossip was relentless. "She's throwing her life away," they would whisper. She could have any man in the city and she's chosen him? Her parents were furious, demanding that she stop seeing Marco. They couldn't understand how their daughter, with all her potential and beauty, could possibly fall for someone who had nothing to offer. But Isabella didn't care. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Marco showed her a world where love wasn't measured by wealth or status, but by connection and shared dreams. She didn't need fancy dinners or designer clothes when she was with him. All she needed was him, his music, his heart, his soul. One evening, under the stars, Marco took her to a small park where they sat by the river. He pulled out his guitar and began to play, a soft, sweet melody that seemed to echo the rhythm of their hearts. As the song ended, he looked into her eyes and said, "I have nothing, Isabella. No money, no home, no future to offer you, but I love you with everything I have." Tears filled her eyes as she took his hands in hers. "You're wrong, Marco. You have everything I need. You have a heart that's real, a soul that's pure. That's more than anyone else has ever given me." From that moment on, they were inseparable. Despite the constant disapproval of her family and friends, Isabella chose Marco. She moved into a small, rundown apartment with him, far from the glamorous life she had once known. But she was happier than she had ever been. Together, they built a life filled with love, laughter, and music. As time went on, Marco's talent began to catch the attention of others. He started playing at local clubs, and soon his music was being heard across the city. Isabella stood by his side through it all, supporting him as he rose from the streets to become a renowned musician. Years later, as they stood on the balcony of their modest home, looking out over the city that had once been so unkind to them, Marco wrapped his arms around Isabella and whispered, "I still can't believe you chose me." Isabella smiled, resting her head against his chest. "I didn't choose you because of what you had, Marco. I chose you because of who you are, and I'd choose you all over again." Their love had defied the odds, overcoming the judgment of others, the hardships of life, and the vast difference in their backgrounds. In the end, it wasn't money or status that mattered. It was love, pure, simple, and real. And for Isabella, that was the only kind of wealth she had ever truly cared about. As the years passed, Marco's rise to fame brought both joy and challenges to their lives. His music, once played in the dim streets of Milan, now filled concert halls and echoed through radios across the country. His fame grew, and with it came the pressures and complications that neither Marco nor Isabella had ever anticipated. At first, it was thrilling. Isabella was so proud of him. Every time she saw him on stage, surrounded by thousands of adoring fans, her heart swelled with pride and love. He had come so far from the man she had found playing guitar on the street, and she had stood by his side through it all. But with fame came long tours, nights spent apart, and a growing distance that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. At first, it was subtle: missed dinners, late-night rehearsals, and phone calls that ended too soon. Marco's manager began to pressure him to take on more gigs, bigger venues, longer tours abroad. His schedule became packed, and their quiet life together was replaced by the constant whirlwind of his career. Isabella, once his closest confidant, now found herself waiting alone in their modest home, wondering when he would return. She reminded herself constantly that this was the life they had worked for. She had always believed in Marco's talent, and she wanted him to succeed, but as the months turned into years, she couldn't ignore the gnawing ache in her heart. The man she had fallen in love with, the one who had played songs for her under the stars, seemed to be slipping away, lost in a world of fame and recognition. The final blow came one cold winter night. Marco had been away on tour for nearly 6 months, only coming home for brief visits that felt more like a formality than a reunion. Isabella tried to hold on, convincing herself that things would get better, that once the tour ended, they would go back to the life they had built together. but deep down, she knew that something fundamental had shifted. One evening, while Marco was in Paris for a show, Isabella received a phone call from one of his bandmates. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost apologetic. "I thought you should know," he said, his tone filled with regret. "Marco's been spending a lot of time with a woman on this tour. She's a singer, a part of the opening act. They've been seen together a lot." The words hit Isabella like a punch to the gut. She didn't want to believe it. How could Marco, the man who had promised to love her with everything he had, betray her like this? She hung up the phone, her hands shaking, her mind racing. Memories of their early days together flooded her thoughts. How they had sat on the cold pavement, dreaming of a life filled with love. How they had defied everyone who said their love wouldn't last. And now it felt like all of that was slipping through her fingers. She didn't confront Marco right away. Instead, she waited. She waited for him to come home, to look her in the eyes and tell her that the rumors weren't true. But when he finally returned, exhausted from the tour, the distance between them was palpable. He didn't seem like the same man anymore. His eyes, once filled with warmth and affection, now held a weariness she couldn't reach. And when she finally asked him about the woman, his hesitation, his lack of denial, was all the confirmation she needed. Isabella's heart shattered. She had given up everything for Marco, her family, her friends, the life she could have had. And now, it felt like it had all been in vain. She had chosen love over comfort, authenticity over luxury. And yet here she was, alone in the very life she had fought so hard to build. In the weeks that followed, their home became a place of silence and tension. Marco apologized, begged for her forgiveness, but the damage had been done. The trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship was gone, replaced by a lingering doubt that neither of them could shake. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the weight of everything between them hung in the air. Marco looked at Isabella, his eyes filled with regret. "I never meant to hurt you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You're the only person who's ever really believed in me. But I've lost myself in all of this, and I don't know how to find my way back." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes. She had loved Marco with all her heart, but the man she had fallen in love with was no longer the one sitting before her. Fame had changed him, had taken him away from her in ways she never could have anticipated. She reached out, taking his hand in hers, and for a moment it felt like they were back in the early days, when nothing else mattered but their love. But the truth was undeniable. They had grown apart, their dreams pulling them in different directions, and no matter how much they wanted to, they couldn't go back to the way things were. "I love you, Marco," Isabella said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I always will, but sometimes love isn't enough." Marco's face crumpled, and for the first time in a long time, she saw the man she had fallen in love with. But it was too late. The wounds were too deep, the distance too wide to bridge. In the days that followed, they made the painful decision to part ways. Marco left the home they had shared, taking with him the memories of their love, but leaving behind the life they had tried so hard to build together. Isabella stayed in the city, but the streets that once felt so alive with possibility now felt empty and cold. She often found herself wandering to the corner where she had first met Marco, remembering the way his music had captivated her, the way his love had once made her feel whole. But now it was just a memory, a chapter of her life that had come to an end. Years later, Isabella would hear Marco's music on the radio, his songs still filled with the same raw emotion that had drawn her to him in the first place. But instead of filling her with joy, it only reminded her of what they had lost. She had loved deeply, and she had lost. And though the pain of their separation never fully healed, she knew that she had done the right thing. Because sometimes, even the greatest loves aren't meant to last forever. And sometimes, the hardest thing to do is to let go. Months passed since Marco and Isabella parted ways, but the echoes of their love haunted both of them in ways neither had expected. Isabella tried to move on, to reclaim the life she once knew before Marco entered her world, but everything reminded her of him. The songs that played on the radio, the coffee shop they used to visit, even the old guitar she had bought him as a gift, now gathering dust in the corner of her apartment. She thought about throwing it away, ridding herself of anything that connected her to him, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Despite everything, Marco was still a part of her. His presence lingered like a ghost, haunting her dreams and turning her waking moments into a swirl of bittersweet memories. One rainy afternoon, Isabella found herself standing at the same street corner where she had first seen Marco playing his guitar all those years ago. The familiar smell of wet pavement filled the air, and the sound of distant street performers echoed through the alleyways. But this time, there was no Marco, no music, only the empty space where their love had once bloomed. She felt a pang in her chest, a deep ache that had never really gone away. The breakup had left her shattered, and though she tried to hide it from the world, she felt broken in ways she couldn't explain. Every attempt at moving forward felt futile. Friends would invite her out, offer comforting words, but nothing seemed to fill the void he had left behind. The songs that played on the radio, the coffee shop they used to visit, even the old guitar she had bought him as a gift, now gathering dust in the corner of her apartment. She thought about throwing it away, ridding herself of anything that connected her to him, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. Despite everything, Marco was still a part of her. His presence lingered like a ghost, haunting her dreams and turning her waking moments into a swirl of bittersweet memories. One rainy afternoon, Isabella found herself standing at the same street corner where she had first seen Marco playing his guitar all those years ago. The familiar smell of wet pavement filled the air, and the sound of distant street performers echoed through the alleyways. But this time, there was no Marco, no music, only the empty space where their love had once bloomed. She felt a pang in her chest, a deep ache that had never really gone away. The breakup had left her shattered, and though she tried to hide it from the world, she felt broken in ways she couldn't explain. Every attempt at moving forward felt futile. Friends would invite her out, offer comforting words, but nothing seemed to fill the void he had left behind. Marco's fame continued to grow. His face was on billboards, his songs climbed the charts, and yet, for all his success, there was an emptiness within him that no amount of applause could fill. He had everything he'd ever dreamed of: the fame, the recognition, the adoration of thousands. But without Isabella, it all felt hollow. He missed her laugh, the way she'd light up when he played her favorite songs, the quiet moments they shared when the world wasn't watching. The woman he had briefly been involved with on tour was long gone, a fleeting mistake that had cost him the love of his life. Marco thought about calling Isabella countless times, but every time he picked up the phone, guilt overwhelmed him. He knew he had hurt her too deeply, and he couldn't bear the thought of facing her rejection. But fate had other plans. One evening, months after they had separated, Marco found himself at a charity event, a gala for an organization that supported struggling artists. It was the kind of event he usually avoided, but his manager had insisted it would be good for his image. As Marco moved through the crowd, exchanging polite nods and forced smiles, he felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness. It was a feeling that had become all too familiar. And then he saw her. Across the room, standing near the entrance, was Isabella. She was dressed in a simple, elegant black dress, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. She looked beautiful, more beautiful than he remembered. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment it was as if no time had passed, as if they were still in love, still two souls entwined in their shared dreams. But when their eyes met, the reality of their separation came crashing down. Isabella's gaze was guarded, her expression unreadable. She hadn't expected to see Marco that night, and the sight of him brought back a flood of emotions she had tried so hard to bury. The room seemed to disappear around them as they stood there, frozen in place. It was Marco who finally broke the silence, making his way over to her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice filled with longing. She didn't respond at first, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for the man she had once known. But he looked different now, older, wearier, a shadow of the person she had fallen in love with. "Marco," she finally said, her voice soft but distant. There was an awkward pause as they stood there, the weight of their history hanging between them like a heavy cloud. "I didn't expect to see you here," Marco said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Neither did I," Isabella replied, her eyes flickering with a mixture of emotions. They stood there, surrounded by the glitz and glamour of the gala, but all Marco could see was her. He wanted to say so much, to apologize, to tell her how much he missed her, how empty his life had been without her, but he didn't know where to begin. "How are you?" he asked, the question feeling painfully inadequate. I'm okay," she said, though her eyes betrayed her. She wasn't okay, not really. The wound was still there, hidden beneath the surface, and seeing Marco again had only torn it open. Marco took a deep breath, the guilt gnawing at him. "I'm sorry, Isabella, for everything. I never should have let things get so bad between us." Isabella looked away, her jaw tightening. "It's too late for apologies, Marco. You made your choices and I made mine." Her words stung, but Marco knew she was right. He had chosen fame, chosen the life that had ultimately driven them apart. But standing there, looking at her, he realized that all the success in the world meant nothing if he didn't have her by his side. "I know I can't undo the past," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I still love you, Isabella. I always have." Isabella's heart ached at his words, but she couldn't let herself believe them. She had spent too many nights crying over him, too many days wondering where things had gone wrong. "I don't know if love is enough anymore, Marco," she said, her voice trembling. "You broke my heart, and I don't think I can go through that again." Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke, the pain of their breakup still raw. She had loved him with everything she had, but in the end, it hadn't been enough to keep them together. Marco reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I know I don't deserve a second chance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm begging you, Isabella, don't shut me out. Let me prove to you that I've changed, that I'm still the man you fell in love with." Isabella pulled her hand away, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I can't, Marco. I can't go back to the way things were. It's too late." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Marco standing alone in the middle of the crowded room, his heart breaking all over again. And as he watched her disappear into the night, Marco realized that some mistakes could never be undone. No matter how much he loved her, no matter how much he wanted to make things right, he had lost her. And this time, it was forever. Marco stood in the middle of the grand hall, his heart still pounding from the intensity of their brief encounter. The world seemed to blur around him as Isabella's figure vanished into the night. Every part of him wanted to chase after her, to pull her back into his arms and promise her the world. But he knew deep down that it wouldn't be that easy. He had hurt her in ways that apologies and grand gestures could not fix. The months dragged on, and Marco found himself more lost than ever. His music no longer brought him joy. Every note reminded him of her. The fame and fortune that had once felt like the pinnacle of success now felt hollow. His days were filled with meaningless interviews, soulless performances, and the constant ache of missing her. Isabella, too, struggled to move on. Though she had walked away from Marco that night, her heart had never really left him. She tried to focus on her work, her friends, anything to keep her mind off the man who had once been her entire world. But at night, when the city was quiet and she was left alone with her thoughts, the memories would flood back. The way he used to hold her, the sound of his voice as he sang her favorite songs, the warmth of his embrace. One evening, as Isabella sat on her balcony, sipping a glass of wine and gazing out at the city lights, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, expecting a message from a friend or a work notification, but her heart skipped a beat when she saw Marco's name. It was a simple message. "Can we talk?" Her fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether or not to reply. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to continue building the walls she had carefully constructed around her heart. But another part, the part that still loved him, despite everything, ached to hear his voice again. After a long pause, she typed out a response. "I don't know if that's a good idea." A minute later, her phone buzzed again. "Please, just one conversation. If you still want me out of your life after that, I'll respect it." Isabella sighed, conflicted. She knew that talking to Marco could reopen old wounds, but she also knew that ignoring him wouldn't make the pain go away. She took a deep breath and typed, "Fine. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. at the cafe on 5th. The next evening, Isabella walked into the cozy cafe, her heart racing. She hadn't seen Marco since that night at the gala, and she wasn't sure what to expect. Would he be the same man she had loved, or would he be someone different, someone she no longer recognized? When she spotted him sitting at a corner table, her breath caught in her throat. He looked the same, yet somehow different. His usually confident demeanor was subdued, and there was a sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He stood as she approached, a small, nervous smile playing on his lips. "Isabella," he said softly, pulling out a chair for her. "Marco," she replied, her voice more steady than she felt. They sat in awkward silence for a moment, neither knowing how to start. Finally, Marco broke the tension. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I know you didn't have to, and I appreciate it." Isabella nodded, her gaze flickering between him and the table. "What do you want, Marco? Why now?" Marco exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Marco, I've thought about you every day since that night, since before that actually, and I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't keep living like this. Without you, none of this, the fame, the success, means anything." Isabella's heart ached at his words, but she forced herself to stay guarded. "Isabella, you had a chance to fight for us, Marco. You chose your career. You chose a life that didn't include me." Marco whispered, his voice thick with regret. "Marco, I know, I was selfish. I thought I could have it all, the career, the life we dreamed of together, but I was wrong. I lost sight of what was important, and by the time I realized it, it was too late." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "Isabella, it's still too late, Marco. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Marco reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Marco, I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I'm not asking you to pretend like everything is fine, but I am asking for a second chance, a real one this time. I want to prove to you that I've changed, that I can be the man you deserve." Isabella looked down at their joined hands, her heart warring with her mind. She had missed him so much that it hurt, but could she really let him back into her life after everything they had been through? "Isabella, I don't know, Marco. I don't know if I can go through that kind of pain again." Marco's grip on her hand tightened, his eyes pleading. "Marco, I swear to you, Isabella, I'll spend every day for the rest of my life making it up to you. Just give me the chance to show you that I can be better, that we can be better." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Isabella's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but in the end, it was her heart that made the decision. She squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his. "Isabella, okay, Marco, but you have to understand, this won't be easy. I'm still hurt, and it's going to take time for me to heal. But I'm willing to try." A look of relief washed over Marco's face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "Marco, I'll do whatever it takes. I won't let you down this time." As they sat there, hands intertwined, a new sense of hope blossomed between them. It wouldn't be easy, and they both knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, they were ready to face those challenges together. In the weeks that followed, Marco and Isabella slowly began to rebuild their relationship. They took things one step at a time, rediscovering the love they had once shared. There were moments of doubt, moments of fear, but there were also moments of joy, moments that reminded them why they had fallen in love in the first place. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Marco proved to Isabella that he had truly changed. He prioritized her, made time for her, and most importantly, he listened to her, really listened. Their love, once broken, began to heal stronger than before. One evening, as they walked along the river, hand in hand, Isabella turned to Marco, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Isabella, I never thought we'd get here, but I'm so glad we did." Marco smiled, pulling her close. "Marco, I am too. I'll never stop fighting for us, Isabella. Not ever again." And in that moment, as the sun set behind them and the world grew quiet, they both knew that this time their love would last. As the months passed, Marco and Isabella's tentative reconciliation began to falter. Though they had agreed to try, the weight of their past mistakes never truly lifted. Each smile, each tender moment they shared was haunted by the unspoken fears and doubts that lingered just beneath the surface. Isabella tried to believe Marco's promises, but trust, once shattered, proved harder to rebuild than she had imagined. Every time he left for a late-night recording session or canceled a date for a work meeting, her mind raced with memories of all the times he had chosen his career over her. No matter how much she wanted to, she couldn't shake the feeling that, deep down, he hadn't really changed. And Marco, though filled with good intentions, found himself struggling. He wanted to be the man Isabella deserved, but the demands of his career still loomed large. As his fame grew, so did the pressure to perform, to maintain the lifestyle that had once seemed so alluring. He couldn't bear the thought of letting his fans down, and slowly, without even realizing it, he began to slip back into old habits, prioritizing work over the fragile relationship he was trying to mend. One cold winter evening, Isabella sat alone in their apartment, staring at the clock. Marco had promised to be home hours ago, but as usual, something had come up. The flicker of hope that had been keeping her going slowly dimmed with each passing minute. She picked up her phone, scrolling through the messages she had sent him, all left unread. Finally, around midnight, the door creaked open and Marco walked in, looking exhausted. He set his guitar case by the door and smiled weakly at her. "Sorry, the session ran late," he mumbled, rubbing the back of his neck. Isabella stared at him, her heart heavy. "You promised, Marco," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "You promised you'd make time for us." He sighed, his eyes filled with guilt. "I know, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go so late, but the producers needed more time, and It's always something, isn't it?" she interrupted, standing up from the couch. "There's always an excuse, always a reason why you can't keep your word." Marco opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He knew she was right. He had been trying, but it was never enough. The music, the fame, it always pulled him back in, no matter how hard he fought it. "I can't do this anymore, Marco," Isabella whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't keep waiting for you to choose me when you never really will." A silence fell between them, thick and heavy with the truth neither of them wanted to face. Marco's heart sank as he realized what was happening, but he couldn't find the strength to stop it. "Isabella?" He started, but his voice trailed off. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to fix this. Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes and she shook her head. "I've waited so long, Marco. I've given you chance after chance, hoping, praying that things would be different. But they're not. And I don't think they ever will be." Marco stepped forward, reaching for her, but she pulled away, wiping her tears. "I love you," he whispered, his voice raw with desperation. "I love you more than anything." "Love isn't enough," Isabella replied, her voice steady but broken. "Not when it's always on your terms, not when I'm always the one left waiting." She turned and walked toward the bedroom, leaving Marco standing alone in the middle of the room. His chest tightened, and he wanted to shout, to beg her to stay, but the words stuck in his throat. For the first time, he truly understood that he was losing her. The next morning, when Marco woke up, the apartment was eerily quiet. He rolled over, expecting to find Isabella beside him, but the bed was empty. Panic surged through him as he bolted upright, calling her name. There was no answer. He stumbled out of bed and into the living room, where his heart sank at the sight of her suitcase by the door. Isabella stood there, fully dressed, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Isabella, please," Marco begged, his voice shaking. "Don't do this. We can figure it out. We can make this work." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I can't, Marco. I've tried. I've tried so hard, but I can't keep living like this. It's breaking me." Marco took a step forward, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. "I love you," she whispered, her voice filled with pain. "But I have to love myself more." And with that, she picked up her suitcase and walked out the door, leaving Marco standing in the empty apartment, his heart shattered. Days turned into weeks, and Marco found himself drowning in regret. The silence in the apartment was suffocating, a constant reminder of what he had lost. He tried calling Isabella, leaving messages, but she never responded. She was gone, and deep down, he knew she wasn't coming back. The world around him continued to move, the demands of his career pressing down on him, but none of it mattered anymore. The fame, the success, it all felt meaningless without her. He had thought he could have it all, but in the end, he had lost the one thing that truly mattered. One evening, Marco sat alone in the apartment, the sound of his guitar echoing through the empty room. He played the melody of the song he had written for Isabella all those years ago, the one that had made her fall in love with him. But now, the notes felt hollow, like a ghost of a love that was long gone. As he strummed the final chord, tears filled his eyes. He had made too many mistakes. He had taken her for granted, and now it was too late. And in that moment, Marco realized the painful truth. He had spent so long chasing his dreams that he had let the love of his life slip through his fingers. Now, all he had left was the memory of what could have been. He picked up his phone, his fingers trembling, and sent one final message to Isabella. "I'm sorry. I love you. I always will." There was no reply. And so Marco sat in the silence, his heart aching with the weight of his regrets, knowing that he had lost the only woman he had ever truly loved. After Isabella walked out of Marco's life, she thought that leaving him behind would give her peace. But instead, she felt like she had left a part of herself back in that empty apartment. She tried to move on, telling herself that she had made the right decision, that loving Marco had only brought her pain. But every night, the memories of their love haunted her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe she had left too soon. A year passed in a blur of empty days and sleepless nights. Isabella threw herself into her work, trying to distract herself from the ache in her heart, but no matter how hard she tried, Marco was always there, lingering in her thoughts, in the quiet moments when she was alone. One rainy evening, after a long day at the office, Isabella sat in her small apartment staring at her phone. It had been months since she last heard from Marco, but she knew that he hadn't given up. Every so often, a message would appear on her screen, simple and sincere. "I miss you. I love you. Please come back." But she never replied. She couldn't. She had made her choice. As she sat there, contemplating the path her life had taken, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Marco. Her heart skipped a beat as she picked it up, expecting the same pleading words she had seen so many times before. But this time, it was different. "I'm sorry for everything, Isabella. I just wanted you to know that I'm leaving. I've accepted a tour overseas. I won't be coming back to the city. I hope you find happiness. You deserve it. Goodbye." Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words. Marco was leaving? For good? The thought of never seeing him again sent a jolt of panic through her chest. She had always assumed he would be there, somewhere in the background, waiting for her if she ever changed her mind. But now he was really going to be gone. Isabella's hands trembled as she reread the message. Was this really it? Was this how their story was going to end? Before she could think, her fingers began typing. "Marco, wait, please don't go, I need to see you." She hit send, her heart pounding in her chest. Minutes felt like hours as she waited for a reply. She knew she had no right to ask him to stay after everything that had happened, but something deep inside her was telling her that she couldn't let him walk away. Not like this. Finally, her phone buzzed again. "Meet me at our spot, 8 p.m. Their spot. The small, hidden park where they used to go when they wanted to escape the world. The place where they had shared so many secrets, so many dreams. It was where they had first said, "I love you." Isabella glanced at the clock. It was already 7:30. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, her heart racing. The rain poured down in sheets as she ran through the city streets, her mind spinning with a whirlwind of emotions. She didn't know what she was going to say to Marco when she saw him, but she knew she had to be there. When she finally arrived at the park, she was soaked to the bone, her hair clinging to her face. She stood at the entrance, searching through the rain for any sign of him. And then she saw him. Marco stood by the old oak tree, the one where they had carved their initials all those years ago. He looked different, older, maybe a little more worn, but his eyes still held that familiar warmth, the same tenderness that had once made her fall in love with him. For a moment, neither of them moved. They just stared at each other, the rain falling in heavy drops around them, as if the whole world had frozen in time. Finally, Isabella took a shaky step forward. "Marco," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Why did you come, Isabella?" She hesitated, unsure of how to explain the storm of emotions swirling inside her. I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought I could move on. I thought leaving was the right thing to do, but I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop thinking about us." Marco's eyes softened, but there was a sadness there too. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said quietly, "but I understand why you left. I wasn't the man you needed me to be." Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes as she took another step closer. "I don't care about any of that anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't care about the fame, the music, the late nights. All I care about is you." Marco shook his head, his expression pained. "But I haven't changed, Isabella. I'm still the same person. My career is still demanding. I'll still be gone for months at a time. I don't want to drag you back into that life if it's only going to hurt you again." Isabella closed the distance between them, reaching out to take his hand. "I'm not asking for perfection, Marco. I'm just asking for you. I've spent the last year trying to convince myself that I didn't need you, that I could be happy without you, but I can't. I love you. I always have." Marco's hand tightened around hers, and for the first time in a long time he allowed himself to hope. "I love you too, Isabella," he whispered. "I never stopped." They stood there in the rain, the weight of their past mistakes washing away as they held each other. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but in that moment, they both knew that they were ready to try again, to fight for the love that had once brought them so much joy. As they stood beneath the oak tree, the rain finally began to slow, and for the first time in a long time, they both felt a glimmer of hope. But life, as always, had its own plans. A few days later, just as they were starting to rebuild what they had lost, Isabella received a call. It was Marco's manager. Marco had collapsed during rehearsal. They rushed him to the hospital, but by the time Isabella arrived, it was too late. He was gone. The doctors said it was an undetected heart condition, something he had likely been living with for years without ever knowing. The music, the stress, it had all taken its toll. Isabella stood by his hospital bed, her heart shattered into a million pieces. The man she had loved for so long, the man she had finally gotten back, was gone, just like that. And as she wept for him, she realized that life had given them one final gift, a chance to say goodbye, to tell each other the words they had both kept hidden for far too long. She would carry his memory with her forever. And though her heart was broken, she knew that their love had been real, and in the end, that was all that mattered.